on the budgets of the Behavioral Science Regulatory Board as well as the Kansas Board of Healing Arts. But before we get into that, I just want to make sure staff takes attendance. And I believe Representative Potter Partial is on WebEx, but will be in the room shortly after the meeting starts. Representative Partial, are you on? She's not on WebEx yet. Okay. She might be on YouTube or something, but maybe not WebEx. But let me know if she pops on or has any questions. And is there anyone else, Chloe, online? Okay, thank you. But before we get started, just wanted to see if there was any requests for bill sponsorship by the committee. Seeing none, we will move on to the budget presentation for the BSRB. Starting off, we'll have a presentation by Dayton Lemunion with Kansas Legislative Research Department. So Dayton, welcome to the committee, if that's okay.
It is. Good morning. Sorry, I thought I was up second today, but I'm ready to go. So you should have a budget analysis in front of you labeled Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. The Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board, I should note, the Executive Director, David Fye, is here. He'll present after me and be available for any questions that you might have. The Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board regulates a number of professions in the state of Kansas. You can see the list of them there in that second paragraph on page 1. Looking at the graph at the top of the page, you'll see that the bulk of the agency's expenditures are in salaries and wages for its 12 employees. And then the next largest group is in contractual services. Turning to page 2. The agency's approved budget was $1.243 million, and the agency's 2025 request is $1.206. This is a change of $58,000, a decrease of $36,000 from the approved amount. Moving down to figure 4, the agency did not have any state general funds reappropriated or any supplemental requests. Item 3. The agency's request has a deletion of $20,320. This includes the removal of a temporary full-time position that the agency has not used in recent years, and the addition of funds to utilize contract staff instead. That results in the net decrease of $20,000. And the Legislative Budget Committee did concur with this request. Turning to page 3. The agency's budget had other adjustments changing from the approved, which resulted in a decrease of $16,000, all from the BSRB fee fund. This included changes in employee benefits, meals and lodging, and attorney's fees. And turning to page 4. Compared to the agency's 2025 approved budget of $1.243 million, the 2026 request is $1.226 million, a decrease of approximately $17,000. Again, all from the board's fee fund. Moving down to figure 7. The agency's request did not include any enhancement requests. You do see the continuation in item 2 of the removal of the temporary position and the addition of contractual services. And in item 3, if you'll turn to the next page. The agency had other changes, resulting in an increase of $3,337, all from the fee fund, which includes similar changes as the previous year, including benefits, lodging, and attorney's fees. And turning to page 6. Since the agency is a biennial agency, it does submit a fiscal year 2027 request. And again, comparing this to the 2025 approved of 1.243, the request was $1.234 million, which is a decrease of $8,911. Moving to figure 10, the agency did not request any enhancement requests. And you see in item 2, the temporary position being, the deletion being continued in 2027. And finally, item 3, all other adjustments, an increase of $11,400 compared to the 2025 approved for benefits, lodging, attorney's fees, other miscellaneous changes. If you will turn to page 8. The first figure is a reference table of the agency's historic expenditures, historical from 2017 through the 2026 agency request, as well as their FTE positions, as well as a breakdown by program. And on the next page, there are 2 more tables. The first of which is the special revenue fund balance, going from 2023 actuals to 2027 agency request. Finally, the agency's fees are listed in figure 15. And I'm happy to stand for questions on the budget.
Thank you, Dayton. Are there questions from members of the committee? If so, when you have questions, you might let the vice chair or I know just by kind of giving a sign. And then when we get into some of the bigger budgets, we'll have a lot more questions. And the vice chair will help kind of keep track of that. So we'll start off with Vice Chair Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the attorney fees that you've mentioned 2 or 3 times, what do the attorneys generally do?
So that's a contractual, Mr. Chair, Vice Chair. Those are contractual services. So the agency contracts with attorneys for, Dave could give more of the specifics of exactly what they do, but assisting in their licensing, investigating, just the general operations of the agency. So those are not employees of the agency, but contractual services.
And so you think then, I guess we'll find out from Dave, but they generally help with the investigation of the applicants?
I'm not sure exactly what. That was just an example of the
Okay.
operations of the agency.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Other questions, Representative Fairchild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just wondering on page 2, if you could explain the number 36,490, the agency changed from approved. Is that basically just saying that that was money that they were allocated or money that they could have spent that they chose not to spend?
Mr. Chair, Representative. So last year, the legislature approved a budget for fiscal year 2025, and that amount, if you look in figure 3, was $1.243 million. The agency, now that we're in fiscal year 2025, has revised their estimate, and based on that revision, they have decreased their request by $36,000. So it's revising the estimate that was approved last year. And that $36,000 decrease is made up of changes 3 and 4 in figure 4.
Other questions by the committee? We'll go to Representative Amix.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things that we've talked about the last couple of years, and I know that Mr. Fry will bring it up, had to do with the fee fund and the balance there. And I noticed that there would have been what appeared to be a fairly good look at the fee structure for licenses and things. But under the fee fund itself, it looks like it is anticipated going down pretty far over the next couple of years, if I'm reading that right.
Dayton.
Mr. Chair, Representative. So we're looking on page 9 at figure 14, that top table. It shows the second line is the revenue to the fee fund, so that would be the projected revenue by the agency. In 25, they're estimating 870, then 890, and down to 810. Some of those fluctuations are with compacts coming online that the state has authorized that might result in reduced revenue for multi-state compacts. If you look at the second portion of that graph, the expenditures, you'll see that If you compare agency 2025, 1.205 to 1.225, there's a slight increase there in the expenditures contributing to that.
Any other questions from the committee for Dayton? If not, we'll thank you, Dayton, for the presentation. And next, I'd like to welcome the Executive Director of the BSRB, David Fye. David, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I do have some testimony that I'll go through for you today, and I'll touch upon some of the questions that were asked, provide some supplemental information. And I do have a couple of handouts in addition to what I had provided previously, if some additional information is needed on some of those topics. So, but I appreciate the opportunity to address you all today about the budget for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. We are a small fee-funded agency, so we receive money through the fees that we receive from licensing professionals in 7 mental health professions. One way to think about our agency, if you're not familiar with the BSRB, is that we are essentially 7 agencies in one. So we have individuals from the social work profession, professional counseling, marriage and family therapy, addiction counseling, licensed psychology, master's level psychology, and behavior analysis. And what this is called in some other states is a composite board. So there is one board, and it's made up of individuals from those professions, as well as 4 representatives from the public. And the agency is the model for efficiency and effectiveness, in part because we are able to use resources and share them across licensing and overseeing the discipline of professionals that have a connection based on the mental health or behavioral health nature of those professions. One other thing I'd like to point out is that the board has 7 standing advisory committees. So there is one for each of the 7 professions that we regulate. So while the board meets every other month for about 3 hours, we have 7 additional standing advisory committees, and those 7 committees meet for 2 hours each. There's one that's composed of about 12 social workers, the one that has close to about 10 marriage and family therapists, additionally, for each of those professions. And that gives each of the professions the opportunity to discuss topics relevant to the professions and make recommendations back to the board. In the past few years, I have seen a trend at the national level where there are other states that are moving to what is currently working well in Kansas. 2 examples would be Utah and also Iowa. Iowa specifically has reached out to say they have put together our mental health professions. We're doing these things called advisory committees, and they've asked for assistance with how to make that structure work. So been happy to let them know about how well things are working here in Kansas and give them advice in terms of how to make that process work well. We do oversee about 16,000 active permanent licenses for the different 7 professions we oversee. That is an increase of 658 permanent licenses above the number from 1 year ago. And it's an increase of 1,332 licenses from 2 years ago. So happy to report in terms of these professions, there has been strong, consistent growth, and the numbers do continue to rise. In my testimony there, I did include the current number of licensees for each of the 7 professions, so you can see the different numbers for those different professions there. As I mentioned, we are a small fee-funded agency. We only have 1 fund, so you might see us a little bit differently than some of the larger agencies you'll see later this session. Our 1 fund is the BSRB fee fund, so all the revenue gets deposited into that fund. We don't receive any money for operations from the state general fund. And in fact, by statute, based on the nature of us being a biennial agency, we contribute 10% of our revenue up to a cap of $100,000 each year back to the state general fund, and that money gets used for operations. Last year, we contributed about $91,000 back to the state general fund. We are asking for no supplemental requests for funding or enhancement funding, and in fact, as Dayton mentioned, I thought his summary was very, very good. For the 3 years in question, fiscal year 25, 26, and 27, the amount the legislature approved for us last year for 25, we are coming in with a request to be under that amount for each of the 3 fiscal years. One of the main reasons that we wanted to submit a request is because when I came to you last year and the year before, we were trying to estimate inflationary costs. And I told you at the time, I would love to come back before you and come in with a budget that's less, but it's hard to predict those factors. So with more current information, I can tell you that we are seeing some amounts that are lower, so I don't think we'll need quite the amount that we were approved for. As a fee-funded agency, if we don't spend that money, it just stays in the fund. So it will be there, and then the longer that money stays in the fund, the longer time it will have to be to where we'll have to consider any kind of changes in fees. The amount that we did request for fiscal year 2025 was $1,206,956, and that was a decrease of about $36,000 below what we were approved for last year. As Dayton mentioned, the main reason for that, we had approval to hire an unclassified part-time position. This did not count as an FTE position. It was just a position that we had available if we had a period of time where we had more applications come in and we needed additional help. Over the years, we have filled that position at times, but not all the time. So it made more sense for us to go ahead and bring that to you and just ask that that position be eliminated. So we have 12 full-time positions aside from that. And if we need additional help, we can just hire temp staffing to come in for a brief period of time, and that has worked well for us in the past. Some of the other decreases have to do with re-estimating some contractual services, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go through some of the other years. The governor did recommend the same amount that we requested in fiscal year 2025, and I'm also aware that the legislature's position on the budget in House Bill 2007 has the same amount as what the governor had recommended as well and what we had requested. So we have no request for anything different than that. For fiscal year 2026, I apologize for the slight typo in here. In my testimony, it says that our revised estimate for expenditures is $1,227,210, and that amount should be $1,226,463. So apologize about that slight difference, but the amount that isn't reflected in Dayton's material, that number is accurate, and that does match what the governor had recommended, and it also matches what's in the bill. So we have no request for anything different than that. The amount that we do have for our request in 2026 is an increase above what our revised request is for 2025. Part of that does deal with fringe benefit cost. When we put the budget into the cost indices, some of those amounts for things like employer contributions for state employee capers or health insurance do go up in the out years. So some of that is attributable to that. We also do expect some inflationary cost as we deal with certain vendors for services. The cost for Office 365 tends to go up about every year. Additionally, some of the cost for board members to get reimbursed for traveling to meetings and things like that, we expect to continue to rise a little bit. So a little bit of an increase, but overall, those amounts for 26 are relatively flat compared to 25. And then for fiscal year 27, a slight increase above what we had requested for fiscal year 26, mostly for the same reasons, changes in the cost indices, and then also estimates in terms of some of those contractual services. I did want to touch upon some of the program information for the agency. Over the last few years, we have heard from the legislature and from the public requesting us to review our rules for licensure to try to modernize those requirements. There have been a number of different programs moving to online programs, and so the board has taken a very active approach looking at the requirements for those online programs. And over the last few years, we've implemented a number of changes in the regulations. I highlighted a few of those before you. For applicants from non-accredited schools, we now allow some of their coursework to be met either in person or online by screen by synchronous video conferencing. We've also expanded the types of degrees that can be held by chairs to meet certain requirements for different programs. And then we've also recognized a national accrediting body for the addiction counseling profession. And when people come from a program that's nationally accredited, we can move those people through the process a lot more quickly. Additionally, in terms of outreach, I mentioned the different advisory committees that assist the board. Back in January of 2021, we started broadcasting our board meetings and advisory committee meetings on a YouTube channel. I'm happy to report that that has been very, very successful in terms of helping members of the public and licensees know about the work of the board. We have broadcast 187 meetings since that point, and those have been viewed over 10,000 times. So really happy with that has been successful, and other states have been asking us for information about that process and have been starting to do that themselves. We also provide outreach to different schools, speaking to students about the application process to help them understand that process and get through that more quickly, help them understand their role as a professional in terms of disciplinary matters as a licensee, and then also provide some resources from the BSRB. Additionally, last year, and again this year, we hosted 2 online forums, one specifically for educators and then one for employers. that basically we put together some information about changes in the law over the last few years. And then we opened it up for comments and feedback so that those individuals could provide more information to the board on potentially requested changes. There have been questions at times about the balance in the BSRB fee fund, so I did want to discuss that. At the end of January 2023, or during that time period, our balance in our fund was right around $2.2 million. And at the time, the Budget Committee expressed concern that it was too high. A number of changes have happened since that point. We have hired some additional staff, and we have worked on reducing the amount in the budget. And so the following year, in January 2024, the amount was going down, and it was just a little over $2,038,000. And I'm happy to report now the balance in the fund has gone down to about 1.9 million. Revenue and expenditure are not at the same amount every month. So last month it was actually down to about 1.8 million. So it is decreasing, but it's decreasing by a steady amount. The legislature did ask us to consider if there could be additional fee decreases. And so I do have some information on recent board action that has met to decrease additional fees. And I'll go into a bit more detail about that. But we also have joined about 3 different multi-state compacts, and those multi-state compacts are changing the way that people become licensed and the revenue that we receive as an agency. One of those compacts is fully operational, and that is the SIPAC compact. We have seen some loss of licensees because of that, but not a significant amount. The other 2 compacts, the social work compact and professional counseling compact, we thought those compacts would be closer to being operational by this point. So when we submitted our budget in September, part of our decreased revenue was based on those compacts being operational. At this point, it's looking like they will become operational towards the end of 2025. So if I submitted our budget today, I would revise our revenue totals to be a little bit higher than what was in the budget when it was submitted. Concerning those upcoming fee decreases, the board did meet and looked at our licensing fees. Back in 2019, the board did vote to decrease our license renewal fees and our application fees by $50 each. About 2 years ago, the board also reduced our fees for temporary licenses, so they would all be $50. And just recently this year, the board took a different action and looked at our initial license fees. And basically, the board decided for those agencies that have initial license fees, those fees should be decreased by $50 as well. And there's about 16 different professions that would get a decrease in fees because of that. So the board is working on implementing those through the regulatory process. Hopefully that will become effective this summer. We anticipate that that'll be a decrease in revenue of about $75,000 on a yearly basis once that's implemented. And I do have a handout if you'd like to see that broken out by the different types of fees as well. So just in addition, I wanted to highlight some recent actions that we are doing for the future. We recently changed our website to allow that to be more accessible, especially by people with mobile platforms. We've also entered a partnership with a company called CE Broker, and that's a free service we're issuing to our licensees to allow them to get a platform to document their continuing education when they complete that. So if they're selected for audit, we can go in the portal and approve them for audit more quickly. We are also putting out surveys for our licensees to learn about what issues are going on out in the field. And then last, we are moving the agency's licensing system to what the state had passed for the enterprise licensing platform. So we are about 7th in line, so we are in the process of discovery right now, but we're working with representatives from OITS to get that process moving, and hopefully in the next 2 years, we'll be fully moved over to that. So that's the material in my testimony concerning the questions that were brought up previously. What we receive legal services for is, as a small agency, we don't have our own in-staff attorneys. But when we have applicants that apply for licensure, and there are situations where someone, let's say, has a previous felony conviction or has an issue the board needs to review, they meet with legal counsel on those specific applications. And if the board does decide those individuals should be denied for licensure, legal counsel will draft orders for that. Additionally, when there are complaints against practitioners, there's a subset of the board called the Complaint Review Committee that reviews those reports with the investigators, and our legal counsel does is help the investigators during that process. And then also when they review those decisions, legal counsel will draft those disciplinary orders, and if they are appealed, they will go to the Office of Administrative Hearings and represent the board. Additionally, in terms of some of the other questions that were asked, yes, we do try to keep our funding and our revenue and expenditures as accurate as possible. It is hard sometimes to estimate how much we will need, but I do want the budget committee to know that, if we don't need money, I don't intend to spend it. If we can find savings, the budget committee sets a limit for us each year, but if we can come in under that after it's set, I always try to do that. So I hope to never come before you and say we spent up to our limit. I hope there's always a little bit of savings each year. But if we need to revise our estimate, either upwards or downwards, I'll just come back and let you know one way or the other. So with that, I'll go ahead and end my testimony and see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Director Fye. Appreciate your testimony today before the committee. Are there any committee questions? Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for your testimony, and and I appreciate you saving us some money and so returning it. But I am just curious, how on a yearly basis, how many temp staff workers do you bring on?
It kind of depends. We have 12 full-time staff members, and some of that depends on if we have any illnesses or individuals that have to be away from the office for a prolonged period of time. I think in the last few years, we've spent somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000 on a yearly basis for temp staffing, but it really just depends on those factors. If we have sustained staffing, we may not need a lot of it, or if we don't see an influx of applications. We do anticipate that we will have one staff member retire at some point over the next year. And so we might use some of that as a bridge until we can find a new permanent employee. But that's kind of the range that we've seen, about 10,000 to 20,000 on a yearly basis. And if we find the right person, that's great. If we need to find a different temporary person, it might be a few people in a given year.
Representative Wagoner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also second the comment from my colleague about really trying to hold the line on current expenditures. I do, though, the 10-year expenditure history, this agency has gone up like 85% in 10 years, which is kind of striking. And I'm just wondering what has changed so much since 2019 that the budget is so much higher than what it used to be.
Director Fye.
I appreciate you asking about that. Yeah, so there's been about two main reasons why it's gone up the most. So in my testimony, the last pages that I provided to you is a history of our permanent licensees. You can kind of see during the past 9 years, from 2015 to the current year, it's gone up by from 12,000 licenses up to about 16,000 licenses. So I came on board as director back at the end of 2020, and there had been no change in staffing for the last few years leading up to that. But there were issues when I came on board. There were delays. I think part of that was because as we had more and more people applying for licensure, staffing had remained consistent, and we just needed more staff to be able to spread that work out and have more people going through. So part of it has been hiring additional staff members. Part of it also was the legislature did pass a bill back in 2021 that reduced the amount of time for reciprocity for licensure. Some people refer to that as a universal licensing legislation, but we did have a lot more people getting through that process more quickly, and there were some time frames for military members and military spouses, so we had faster time frames we needed to meet for that. So bringing on additional staff to meet those requirements. There was also a change in how small state agencies were treated, to be direct. In previous years, agencies contributed about 20% of their revenue to the state general fund, and they received for that contribution, they received services from the state, like legal services and different things like that. Well, there was a change in philosophy through those years that basically led to the agency contributing 10%, and that was across the board for state agencies like the BSRB. But we contributed 10% instead, but then those agencies that previously had provided services at no cost to the agency, now we're able to charge for those services. So one of the big costs was moving from receiving legal services from the Attorney General's office to now being billed by the Attorney General's office, and then recently for us moving to private legal counsel. Additionally, our old licensing database was through Access, And as you might know, Microsoft is discontinuing Access, and it's not as stable as other better platforms. So moving from that to a better platform did lead to a significant cost to the agency as well. So mostly it was the increased staffing that we've seen, the change in legal cost, and then also the licensing system. And partially, when you see all the number of new licensees that are being licensed in Kansas, that's really good news. But if we don't increase staffing to meet that, it just will mean that people will have a longer time to wait before they can become licensed.
Thank you. Any other questions? Representative Amix.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And David, this might be for you and it may be for Brianna or Jill. And I want to say I appreciate 10% revenue to the state's general fund with a cap of up to $100,000. Have you ever been told what that $100,000 can be used for? Or is it just kindness of your organization?
Well, by the statute, we have to contribute that. So that is a mandatory contribution. So that is not a choice that we make. In terms of what we are currently receiving, I can't provide a lot of good detail on that. In the past, we had been provided things like legal services from the Attorney General's office, HR services from the Department of Administration, other services like that. But when it changed from the 20 to the 10%, and those entities could now bill for services or charge, for a certain amount of contract, it really changed that. So we still contribute 10%, but I honestly couldn't tell you exactly what we received back for the 10%. In terms of how it can be used by the state, I don't think there's any requirements on what the state can and can't use it for, though.
Representative Amix, go ahead.
The only reason that I bring it up is when you talk about legal services in your budget and knowing that possibly you can obtain legal service through the Attorney General's office. I don't know, it seems like to me that like double spending or something, but somebody could explain.
Well, there is some history there with the Attorney General's office. I believe we did that last year. Was that a little bit? But Director Fye, but then also our revisor could shed some more light on exactly about that 90-10 split and what value, I guess, the state can contribute back.
So what that, historically, what that money's been used for is the Department of Administration assisting with payroll, assisting with Department of Administration legal, and human resources, like Director Fye said. But historically, the general thought is state general fund agencies, of course, are funded from the state general fund, so they wouldn't contribute. But when fee fund agencies are funded by fees from attorneys, from real estate agents, counselors, psychologists, that the state administration is not reimbursed for those fees. So historically, that amount was for those sort of fees. And I think the reduction did reflect that with automation, with other things, that those fees, or that cost could go down. And so now it's capped at agencies at 10% or 100,000. And we can get that. The statute has the list of what agencies pay for that. So we could get you a copy of that statute that has that list if you would so like.
Are there any other questions from the committee at this time? We'll probably have time for maybe one or two more. Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do apologize for circling back. I forgot this one question on your page 2. Actually, it's this is a question, then just a request for point of clarification. And I know I'm sweating pennies on this and the whole scheme of things, but I do find it interesting that in fiscal year 2026, you're asking for a 20,000 increase, and the justification for it is for employer fringe benefits and projected increase in contractual services. And if that's the basis of it, why is it only 7,000 the next year?
This partially comes down to the different amounts in the cost indices for those 2 years. They could change again when the cost indices come out next year. But we did plug the numbers in for all the salary based on what the numbers are in the indices for 26 and the numbers for 27. And the majority of that is because there's just different amounts in the cost indices.
And just the point of clarification, I wasn't here, but I think I understand, but how do you have the balance? Is that just carryover from the previous year, or how's the balance for the fee fund?
So basically, we have one fund, and when we have to make expenditures from it, it just decreases that amount. And when we get revenue, it gets deposited each month. And essentially, if we are approved for a certain amount of money and we don't spend it, then it just never gets pulled from that fund. And so the fund just remains in perpetuity. And as long as the number doesn't go down too much, we don't need to look at increasing fees. And so that's kind of, the legislature approves a certain limit for how much we can spend every year, whether we have more money in the fund or not. And so.
Thank you, Director Fye. Appreciate your testimony. I think we have one last question from Vice Chair Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Director Fye, have you seen a significant increase in the number of licensees as we've gotten involved in more compacts?
Well, not necessarily the compacts. I think what remains to be seen right now, the 3 compacts are all created differently. The social work multi-state compact, I think, has the potential to really increase the amount of people providing services into the state. The social work multi-state compact, which we passed in the spring last year, it allows someone to get either a single state license in their home state or a multi-state license, and the multi-state license would allow them to practice into any other compact state. So we could have a lot more social workers moving from state to state, providing services or doing teleservices. That compact is not yet operational, so we don't really know the information as far as who's moving or who's providing teleservices, but we're looking at that being operational either late this year or maybe early in 2026.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Vice Chair, and thank you, Director Fye, for your testimony before the committee today. And we will, at the conclusion of, as we get through the budget presentations, we'll work on the budget recommendations. Thank you. Next, I'd like to welcome up to the podium Megan Leopold from the Kansas Legislative Research Department, presenting the budget for the Board of Healing Arts. Megan, welcome to the committee.
Thank you. You'll have the State Board of Healing Arts packet in front of you. The State Board of Healing Arts licenses and regulates medical, osteopathic, chiropractic doctors, and other medical providers. They have 16 various types of professionals that they license. Other than doctors, that includes, other than medical, osteopathic, and chiropractic doctors, it includes podiatrists, physician assistants, occupational, and respiratory therapists. They have over 36,000 licensees. On page 2, you can see that the agency's request for fiscal year 25 is $126,000, and that's above the previous year's actual expenditures. But the request is no change at all from what the legislature approved for fiscal year 25. So in the table at the bottom of page 2, you can see that the agency did not have any SGF reappropriations. In fact, they do not have any SGF funding as part of their agency budget. They did not have any supplemental requests, and they did not have any changes to their fiscal year 25 budget. On the next page, for fiscal year 26, you can see that the agency's request for fiscal year 26 is $164,000, and that is above what the previous year's request was. So it's $164,000 above fiscal year 25. Looking at the table, figure 7, near the bottom of that page, you can see that they had some adjustments for contractual services. They added $98,000 for contractual services. Again, this is all from their fee fund. These are for expenditures such as increased rent for office space, computer programming, and data processing fees or data access fees. You can also see that the Legislative Budget Committee, which met over the interim, did not have any recommended changes to this item or, for that matter, any other items in their budget. The agency has also requested to add $46,000, all special revenue, and that is largely for expenditures for group health insurance. Item number 4 shows that the agency is requesting an increase to their hospitality spending limit The hospitality spending limit is an item written in statute that limits the amount that agencies can spend, fee agencies for the most part, can spend on hospitality. So food for board meetings, items such as that. The agency currently has a limit of $1,000 and they're asking for that to be raised to $5,000. They are not asking for any additional funding for this. They are asking for permission to have a larger pool of money within their existing expenditures that they can spend for this specific type of item. They're also requesting $18,000 for all other adjustments. Those are largely for commodity and capital outlay expenditures like computer equipment, software, and gasoline. On page 5, you can see the fiscal year 27 analysis. The agency's request is $159,000 above the previous year's request and $323,000 from the fiscal year 25 approved budget. In the table with the yellow line at the bottom, you can see that some of the changes included in their budget that created that increased ask are an addition of $207,000 for contractual expenditures. These are for increased office space rent, IT expenditures for server support and expansion of the agency's information system. They did have a contract that they signed for 3 years of service, so you'll see an increased expenditure in this fiscal year that you would not expect to see in the 2 out years as that contract continues through the 3 years. They're also requesting $84,000, and that's again largely for expenditures for group health insurance. They're requesting an addition of $30,000 for capital outlay. This is for computer equipment and software. And then finally, in all other adjustments of $1,190, and that's largely for commodities such as gasoline and office supplies. On page 7, you can see the 10-year reference table. And then on 8, you can see the agency's special revenue fund resource estimate. This is the Healing Arts Fee Fund from which they pull all of their expenditures. And then at the bottom are the fees that they currently have for licensure. And I'm happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Megan. Are there any questions for the committee, from the committee to Megan? If not, thank you, Megan, for your presentation. Next, I'd like to welcome to the committee the Executive Director of the Kansas Board of Healing Arts, Susan Guile. So Director Guile, thank you for being here today.
Is it on? Now is it off? Did I just... Oh, there we go. Technical difficulties already. Good afternoon, Chair Howe and Commissioners. Thank you for having me. I am Susan Guile, the Executive Director of the Kansas State Board of Healing Arts. You have my testimony, and in the interest of time, I won't go through all of it. Executive Director Fye did an excellent job of explaining fee-funded agencies and how we work, and the Board of Healing Arts is not substantially different than the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board in how our fees work and how we are funded. We are also a net contributor to state general funds up to the $100,000. Our fees are all from our licensees. I do want to point out to you that as you look at our budget, you will notice that our beginning balance at the beginning of the fiscal year might look exceptionally high, and that is because we take in the bulk of our fees at the end of the fiscal year. January, February through June is the end, it's graduation season, and so we get a lot of new applications at that time. It's also our MD renewal cycle. MDs are our largest license type and one of our highest license fees, and so that's where we get the bulk of our money, and that really pushes us through the entire fiscal year. If you look at our budget month to month, we have about 7 months where our expenditures exceed our revenues. And so that starting balance really pushes us through. So that's why that looks exceptionally high. Also, we have the no limit fund, as does the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. And that's where our balance has to be a little bit high so that we can cover any expenditures that we need from from those cases that are funded out of there. We've done an analysis based on our allocation and everything we have encumbered that might go through with those cases for the no limit fee fund. We have roughly $4 million that's really available to us, and that's about 4 months of our operating expenditures. It costs us a little over $500,000 basically to keep our doors open, about $535,000 a month operating expenses. So we really have about $4 million that we have to work with. With that, I think, unless you want me to really go through my testimony, I'm happy to do that, but you have it. Unless you want me to do that, I'll stand for questions.
Thank you, Director Gile. We can reserve the balance of the time for questions and just kind of a back and forth and learning about the budget. So anybody have any questions from the committee? Representative Fairchild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I probably should remember this, but I don't quite remember looking back at previous years from 2024 to 2025. We went from 57 FTEs to 67. I'm sure we've discussed this before, but just refresh my memory on why that happened.
So those are not new FTEs. Those were approved FTEs that we just had not filled. And we really needed to fill them because of changes in the requirements. Much like the BSRB, the number of our licensees just continued to grow. And with new legislative requirements, the military spouses, sports waiver, lots of other things. With all of those comes new requirements for us, not just in the licensing department, but also in our disciplinary department, litigation, and general counsel. So we just really saw the need to fill those positions to get us back up to where we are really still not fully operational. We could use more, but that really helps us get where we need to be so that we can issue licenses in a timely manner, get cases through the disciplinary and litigation process in a more timely manner.
You have any other questions?
And since so you had those FTEs, but they just hadn't, or you had the power or whatever to have those FTEs, but you just didn't fill them until that year. I mean, I'm looking at the salary and the total amount only went up by about $130,000 increase from 2024 to 2025. So I mean, you would think that would be more for 10 FTEs, but was that money just already sitting there? Can you try to explain that?
So all that money was always in our allocation. So we had the legislative approval and the allocation in our budget always for those positions. So much like Executive Director Fry, we have always been committed to being good stewards of our licensees' money. And so every time that we have a vacancy, we want to look at that and determine, do we really need to fill this vacancy? Do we need to fill it exactly how it was, or do we need that position? Can it be better utilized in a different way? So that's part of why those didn't, well, frankly, partly because we're looking at whether they need to be filled, and then also partly because some positions just sat unfilled for a long time. We had a very difficult time filling some attorney positions, so they were posted, and we were actively trying to fill them. We just were not able to for some of them. So there's a combination of reasons why some of the positions weren't filled for a while. But yeah, we're always looking at, do we need to fill this? How can we be the most responsible with the positions that we have? And then some were actively being attempted to fill, and we just weren't having luck filling them. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you, Representative. We'll go to Vice Chair Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me, Director Gile. So how many do you think you might be short now? And what are your biggest challenges with finding people?
That's a great question. I appreciate that. Thank you. In our licensing department right now, I think we are probably okay. We have one position vacant right now. We are also in line for the Acela. And once we get fully automated, I think that will really help. We are also seeing some additional needs from the compact, and we actually just repurposed one of our positions to be more compact focused. In our disciplinary and litigation departments, we could probably use, between the two of them, a handful of staff, and probably another, we have approval to fill one GC attorney and could probably use another.
Did you ever have a significant amount of people working from home? And if so, has that changed? Have most of the people come back to the office?
So like everybody, during COVID, we had virtually everyone working from home, except those who just had to be in the office. Right now, most of my staff are on a hybrid schedule where they have so many days at home and so many days in the office. And they really like that. And it has led them, in my opinion, to have increased productivity.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll go to Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony. I want to circle back on your licensing department and your goal to expedite the process. And how does your timeline in processing license applications compare to other states?
Thank you for that question. I don't know that I can answer it for you as compared to other states. What I can tell you is that our goal, so it's a two-step process. They have the licensing analyst and then the licensing specialist. And our goal is to have them through the licensing analyst within 10 working days and through the licensing specialist within 10 working days, so about 20 working days. We usually exceed that timeline when we're not in the busy season. What we're bumping up against right now, when we hit the busy season, we sometimes exceed that. And that is from the time that we get a complete application. Oftentimes people will send us partial applications. We might not get their FBI fingerprints, for example, or they may send in their application before they've actually graduated. So we don't have so if we get someone's application, for example, today, and they don't graduate until May, we don't start counting from today, or it would sit with us for 6 or 7 months until we actually have a complete application. So does that answer your question?
It does, and it's kind of, last question, Mr. Chair, is that in the conversations with the Kansas Hospital Association and other medical professionals, it does seem like there's a recognized delay or maybe a duplication in which, you know, the process, in order for them to get hired, they have to demonstrate that they have graduated from college, and usually that's from a transcript base. And I just wonder, how much partnership are you doing to help decrease the gap in the timeline and
So that's the
with the
postgraduate.
hospitals?
That's the postgraduate process, and I've had meetings with Kansas Hospital Association and some of our smaller hospitals out west. And I actually had a meeting just today with my staff. We are actively pursuing a way that we can expedite that process because we recognize that that is an issue. However, that is not just our issue, because once we issue their license, then they have to get their DEA number and they also have to get credentialed. And those two things also take, as I understand it, a significant amount of time. So we are one step in that process, and we are working to help alleviate our part in that. But yes, we are actively working to try to find a workaround that will involve my staff as well as the educational institution staff and the hiring hospital staff.
Thank you, Representative Haskins, for that question, because it kind of ties into something I heard about after our meeting today from a hospital in my district. They had mentioned that maybe because of a regulatory change from the Board of Healing Arts, there's now perhaps it's an unintended consequence in delaying the credentialing of some of their healthcare professionals. So is that the same thing that
It's the
Representative
same issue.
Haskins?
So what happened is in, I believe, 2021, and also I want to be clear, it was not a change at the Board of Healing Arts. It was a statutory change that was supported by the Board of Healing Arts, the Kansas Medical Society, the Kansas Hospital Association, and I think virtually everyone else, that postgraduate training needed to go from 12 months to 36 months. And what happened was, oh gosh, it's been a minute since I looked at this. Most postgraduate training at the time was 36 months. Before the change, doctors could get their full and active license after 12 months of postgraduate training. So they would go do their 12 months of postgraduate training, potentially get their active license. Wherever they were going to work at that point could start working on their DEA license and their credentialing because they had their active license while they finished their last 24 months of postgraduate training. Now, since the statute requires 36 months of postgraduate training before they can get an active license, they have to complete their entire round of postgraduate training before we can issue them an active license. So they can't get their active license until they finish their postgraduate training. It's a sequential situation. They get their active license, then they get their DEA, then they get credentialed. So these doctors are graduating June 30th. We issue them their license, and then it's another, and the way it is right now, we may not issue them their license until maybe August, and then it's another so many weeks to get their DEA number, and then another so many weeks or months to get their credentialing.
So Director Guile, what is the Board of Healing Arts doing to remedy this? It sounds like it's a statutory change, not regulatory. Is that correct?
It is.
So it's a bill that the legislature passed and,
Well, and let me be clear, those folks that I met with, nobody believes that the statute change is wrong. Everybody believes the statute change was good and correct. So what we are doing, the idea that we have come up with is for us to work with the educational institutions to add a document to our application, because what I'm hearing from the educational institutions is that, by January, before the postgraduate training ends, these institutions know that these folks are technically qualified and that they're going to finish on technical grounds. They're 2.5 years in. If they weren't technically going to make it, they would have washed out by this point. So we can have the educational institutions with the application for licensure provide us a document that says, hey, Susan Guile is in our program. This is her application. She's doing a good job. She's going to graduate. She's going to finish her postgraduate training June 30th. Signed, here you go. And oh, by the way, it will be our responsibility to let you know if she does something really ridiculous and she's not going to make it. So it gives the educational institution some responsibility to let us know. Then we can go ahead and process that application, set it for July 1, that if we don't hear back from that educational institution, that July 1, we issue that license.
so Director Guile, you're suggesting an administrative fix, not necessarily a legislative fix.
Administrative and process fix on our end, yes.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Vice Chair Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So talk to me about these programs where students are given loan forgivenesses for practicing in a certain area of the state. I mean, how bad is it out in Western Kansas getting licensed professionals? And I know there are incentives to go to Western Kansas. How is that monitored, and how do we know that the people who do at least initially go to Western Kansas stay there the full amount of time that they were supposed to based on the loan forgiveness?
Thank you for that question. It's a great question. That is not something that my agency oversees or monitors. And right now, when a licensee gives us their residential address and their business address, they are, per regulation, supposed to tell us when they move within 30 days, if they change a residence address or a business address. They don't always do that. So I would not tell you that I can give you with confidence a good piece of data about where doctors or any profession are practicing in the state.
So does anybody keep track of that? If it's not your agency, who would it be?
Great question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Vice Chair Sanders. Any other questions from members of the committee? Representative Potter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was mentioned earlier by the revisor that fee-funded agencies can use the Department of Administration for HR and other items under that, especially like accounting. Do you use that? And if not, why not?
So we are, I think, one of the larger fee-funded and regulatory agencies. So we do have an HR director in-house. She uses Department of Administration HR for support when she needs to. So indirectly, yes, we use them. We also have an accountant in-house, but again, she uses Department of Administration, Division of Budget, et cetera, for support when needed. I find them to be really helpful. Department of Administration also has monthly non-cabinet agency meetings where they bring us together to give us kind of, can you still hear me? Okay. Updates on what's happening and gives us an opportunity to sort of network with each other and have time as just the non-cabinet agencies. So I do think that they are doing some work on our behalf, and I do appreciate that from them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Any other questions from members of the committee for Director Guile? Seeing none, thank you, Director Guile, for your testimony before the committee today.
Thank you all.
Okay, committee. Next, I believe in recent days or hours, Committee Assistant Eli has sent out committee rules. So I want him to hand out committee rules. At least you have a physical copy and just not an email copy. So Eli, if you want to pass those around. Then there's also, I believe, guidance for conferees that appear before the committee. So you might be hearing from people in the Capitol over the next coming days or weeks about, hey, I want to come before your committee or whatnot, but to testify, but please direct them to Eli and he'll give them the same sheet. But I just wanted you all to have a copy as well. You can put it in your folder. So the Higher Education Budget Committee rules, it's basically a front and back. Well, it might be 2 pages on your copies, but mine's on my front and back. And these are basically what has come from, worked by a lot of people and I guess fashioned or published by the Speaker Pro Tem's office. And we wanted to make sure all of our committees had the same set of rules. So when you're coming into all your committees, you're not given a different set of rules. So if you have any questions about that, please let me know. Glad to visit with you about those. Next on the agenda is the recommendations for the Kansas Board of Healing Arts and the, actually, we're going to do the Behavioral Science Regulatory Board first, since they were presenting first. The chairman, I don't see any major changes that we need to make as a budget committee. However, you guys might have some input as well. Representative Fairchild, did you have some questions, comments, or discussion?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In order to do this today, don't we have to have some sort of a vote on emergency action?
It's my understanding, I do not, but I'll direct, ask the revisor to clarify that. I believe it's only for bills, but not budget committees. But Jill, can you confirm or deny that if I'm wrong?
Yeah, from last year, it's committee rules, the House doesn't have official rules yet for this biennium. It will be adopted or they're going to be worked on for 25 and 26. But yes, it is just for a bill that was referred to committee, not budgets.
That's a great question, Representative. I had the same one a day or two ago, so thank you. Representative Sawyer?
I would move we recommend the Legislative Budget Committee recommendations for 25 and 26 for this agency.
Okay.
And 27.
Representative Sawyer.
Yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
move the committee recommend to the House Committee on Appropriations to adopt the appropriations for the Behavioral Sciences Regulation Board for fiscal year 25 revised, 26 and 27, as provided in the Special Committee on Legislative Budget and House Bill 2007.
It's been seconded, moved and seconded. Representative Haskins, I think he had his hand up slightly before my vice chair, so it's been moved and seconded. So the motion before the committee is to approve the budget recommendations basically by the LBC and adopt those, including the revised fiscal year 25, fiscal year 26, and fiscal year 27 for the Behavioral Science Regulatory Board. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, we'll proceed to vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion carries. So next we'll do the the Kansas Board of Healing Arts budget recommendations. Is there what's the will of the committee? Vice Chair Sanders.
I move the Committee on the Higher Edge Budget recommend to the House Committee on Appropriations to adopt the appropriations for the Board of Healing Arts for fiscal year 2025 revised, fiscal year 2026, and fiscal year 2027 as provided in the Special Committee on Legislative Budget in HB 2007.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Obviously, when we get into some of the tougher budgets, there will be a lot of discussion, I'm sure. So is there any discussion? Seeing none, we'll proceed to vote. All in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. All opposed, nay. Motion carries. In terms of announcements, there is no meeting for tomorrow. Next meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, January 21st. And again, I'll be participating by WebEx, and Vice Chair Sanders will be chairing the committee room. If you have any questions in the meantime, please let me know. Of course, the governor's presented her budget recommendations earlier this morning before the Senate Ways and Means and the House Appropriations Joint Committee. And so make yourself available to that information as well. Any other questions or announcements? If not, we are adjourned.